Hello, everyone. My name is Nahed Mansour, and I'm the Curator of Programs at the Gardner Museum. Welcome to our Three Works program. Today, the Gardner Museum's Chief Curator, Sequoia Miller, will be in conversation with Heidi McKenzie. They will be discussing three of Heidi's works in connection to the word legacy. The conversation between Sequoia and Heidi will last between 30 and 40 minutes, and a Q&A will follow. We invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. You will notice your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and live streamed through Facebook Live. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on the treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. I'll now mute my mic and video and hand it over to Sequoia.
Great, thank you, Nahed. And hello, everyone, welcome. So glad that everyone could join us for today's Three Works. And hello, Heidi, special welcome to you.
Thanks so much, good to be here.
Yeah, great to see you. So I'll start off by introducing everyone to Heidi. This is Heidi McKenzie, and Heidi is a Toronto-based ceramic and installation artist. She has been practicing full-time since graduating with an MFA in art criticism and curatorial practice from OCAD-U in 2014. Heidi left behind a 20-year career in arts management and radio production to apprentice with Minnie Singh in her father's ancestral home of India in 2009. She has worked as an artist in residence in Jingdezhen, China, Bali, Indonesia, Guldegarard, Denmark, Sydney, Australia, Kexkamet, Hungary, and Medicine Hat, Alberta. Yay, Alberta. Her work has been collected and exhibited internationally. Heidi works in abstraction and in series in order to convey complex narratives and or social commentary about herself, a culture, or her hybrid identity. In 2014, Heidi began working with images on clay. Her recent works relate to her own healing journey, her father's second exile from Trinidad to Canada, and her mother's mixed ancestry. And her mixed ancestry, Indo-Caribbean indentured workers and migrants who fled Ireland during the famine. And looking forward to getting into all of these today as we look at three works from Heidi. So once again, welcome, Heidi. Glad to be talking about legacies today.
Legacy is where it's at.
For sure. What I'm going to do is share my screen again so that we can start discussing the first work that you brought with you to share with us. So let me go here and then here. Okay, so now folks should be able to see a few images of an artwork of Heidi's called Body Interrupted. And I'm wondering if, just as a starting point, Heidi, perhaps you could explain to the participants here what we're looking at.
Sure. So this is a hanging installation. It's 5 mobiles that are hung not in a straight line, sort of in a zigzag line. And each piece is about 5 feet, which I don't know what that is in centimeters, of art. And I'll describe to you what it is before I tell you what's on it. What they are earthenware hand-rolled slabs in irregular shapes, and they're sort of slightly convex or concave, depending on which side you're looking at. And aircraft cabling is connecting them all together, and there are some raku rings interspersed with the imagery. So the piece is called Body Interrupted. Do you want me to just describe the piece?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it's really a love letter to my father. As it happened, about 6 months before my father passed in 2016, I decided I really needed to make work about him and his life while he was alive. And I kind of conceptualized what I wanted to do, shared it with my father, and he said, "Great, let's do it." And the first step involved him stripping down to his boxer shorts and me taking probably over 100 shots of him close up. And it was really incredible. He was gung-ho. At this stage in his life, he was 85 and he had suffered many illnesses. In fact, he was well acquainted with his imminent mortality. His first time he was told he was given 3 years to live, he was 64, and he made it to 85. And so I think it was a really tender and beautiful moment, the documenting of my father. And I have him, you can see the still on the bottom part of the photograph. That's a close-up of part of his face. And, and maybe one panel over, there might be a close-up of the back of his balding head, and then moving down his body, a close-up of the scars from his heart surgery. He had in his mid-50s when 50% of the people were dying on the table. It's not like it is now, like simple appendectomy. Scars on his back from abuse he sustained as a child. Moving down to his emaciated. His ankles at the time were slimmer than my wrists. So
Heidi, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if I could ask you to speak up just a little bit. Some of our participants are having a hard time hearing.
Sure. Okay. Do you want me to repeat any of that, or should I keep going?
Maybe just pick up. So Heidi's been, for those folks who have been having a hard time hearing, Heidi's been telling us about this piece and the imagery on the work, and how she was taking photos of her father very late in his life, and how it was a very intimate and very warm experience, I think you could say, and how you sort of captured the kind of his history that was mapped onto his body through his life experiences, scars, him being very, very, having very skinny ankles, being very slender at the time.
Right. So that's one side of each of those tiles. And is the volume a little better there? Yeah.
I think so. We'll see if we get messages. Yeah, but just nice and strong with your voice.
That's one side. And they're in color. So they're actually inkjet color decals that I used a highly toxic material to affix onto the glazed ceramic surface. And on the flip side, I have what I call memory images. And those would be photographs of my father's life that spanned when he started taking slides, 1955 to 1985. And I have to tell you that my father was a phenomenal amateur photographer. And when we cleared out his office, there were 8,500 slides. And my partner went through all of them and chose 1,500 with people on them. And we had the 1,500 digitized. And of those 1,500 slides, there were maybe 20 where my father was on the other side of the camera. So I had very little material to work with. Because what I wanted to do is document that part of his life, in this piece. So, and the body interrupted. The title is very specific because I just mentioned that he struggled with his mortality many times, and I believe he was diagnosed with 7 different terminal illnesses. And, from the age of 54 to 85. And his incredible will to survive. I mean, he was a scientist. He got himself into drug trials. He fought for the funding to be on those drug trials. He got himself, he was a survivor. And so I think that, his body was interrupted at many times in his life, but he managed to keep going and contribute and lead a full life.
Wow, yeah, for sure. I'd love to pick up on this idea of interruption and interrupted, to bring in the idea of exile. And so in the introduction, I mentioned your father as being exiled twice in a way, from his ancestral homeland of India to the Caribbean, and then a second time into Canada. So I'm curious about this idea of interruption, and not just sort of the physical or the bodily interruption. Well, I guess exile is very much a physical and a bodily interruption, but in a different way, I suppose. And one thing that strikes me about the work is that the objects are hanging. You know, you have these kind of three hanging mobiles, and they're not grounded in a way. And I'm wondering how that notion of grounding and exile and interruption fit together for you in this piece.
I like that. I hadn't actually thought about the lack of grounding. What I thought about in this piece was the fragility and the movement, you know, kind of shifting sand, not walking on firm ground. But you bring up a very good point. So in terms of exile, I'm not sure that all viewers would be familiar with the story of how, you know, 40% plus of the island of Trinidad are now people of South Asian descent. Can I just give you a snapshot?
Yeah, for sure.
So Britain got rid of emancipated the African slaves in 1832. And up until that time, that was their primary source of labor for the sugar plantations, the cocoa plantations, pineapple plantations. Basically, they were the slave labor. And when emancipation took place, there was a huge scramble to figure out what were the colonies in the Caribbean going to do to continue to produce at the level they needed to produce for industry. You know, a number of things happened. The Chinese came in, the Portuguese came, but ultimately the indentured workers were legislated so that they're, you know, very carefully legislated so that they would be legal. But in the end, really, I think we have to face the facts that even though they signed contracts to come saying that they were going to work so many years and then eventually they could return, or they could, you know, purchase the land or have rights to the land, that most of the people who came, and I believe there were over 1 million who went to the British colonies between 1845 and 1917, really didn't understand what they were signing. Many were illiterate. And many came from the farming communities and the rural communities in India. So that's sort of a thumbnail shot. My ancestors, just as I've been doing the research, I didn't even realize that my ancestors landed, both of them, my maternal and paternal ancestors landed in Guyana. And it was my great-grandfather who moved to Trinidad, and hence my Indo-Trinidadian heritage.
Cool. Thanks for going through, kind of running through that or giving us a synopsis of that. I guess one thing that I would like to pick up on that you mentioned in reference to, I guess there are two things that I'd like to ask about. So maybe first, I would ask about this idea of research, which you just referenced, and the notion of archive. And I think that in the same way that you're now researching your matrilineal line, at this time you're researching your patrilineal line, more of your dad's ancestry. And you've described how in this piece you are using both images that you took of your dad, of your father, and also images that he took from the 50s into the 70s. So thinking about those two sort of image sources and then this idea of research, I'm wondering how you think about archives. And, you know, I think a lot of people would identify Michel Foucault as kind of one of the first people to help us see that archives are not sort of neutral collections of information, but much like museums, in fact, like the Gardner and many other museums, they are, they represent certain priorities and enforce certain power relations. So as you are starting, I guess since 2016 or 2014, you said to work with these images and these sort of archive banks of images. I'm wondering what how your thinking has developed around the archive and what that is, what it means to you, what your impact can be upon it, how it has helped to form both your work, but also your thinking about yourself and your ancestry.
Great question. I think, you know, I hadn't, before I started down this line of working with my own family's images, I hadn't really thought much about archive. I mean, you know, peripherally I'd thought about it, but it hadn't really become real. And I mean, in very real terms, I'm organizing the digitization of the visual and written archive of both my paternal and maternal lines. I mean, it's only since COVID have I actually uncovered the real truth. I believe it to be the real truth.
Uh-oh, real truth. That's a tricky one.
Anyway, a bit of overkill there, but about how McKenzie came to be our name. And that, I guess that would be through, you know, reaching out. And so how do I understand archive? Has become that an archive is a repository, but at the same time, it's a system of networks. And I wouldn't be able to form an archive without the support and system of my relatives and you know, other people that I've been able to reach out to form the archive. But in a more general sense, I have a much greater appreciation for archive. I find myself in pre-COVID times going out to view photographic exhibitions based on archive, you know, to really start to grapple with and get a sense of complexity in what's available. I mean, the AGO has just purchased last year Montgomery Collection, which is the largest archive of Caribbean photography of this era in the world. That's very exciting to a lot of academics and artists in the field. So I think, have I answered your question?
Yeah, sure. And opened up new questions too. So do you see yourself kind of tapping into that Montgomery archive as a slightly broader source of information or of cues or of directions for you?
I absolutely do. I hope to. I know that following their inaugural exhibition, that the archive will be made more available, more largely available, and I certainly look forward to getting into that.
Right. So that's the other thing about archives is when they're open, like who opens them and when they're open and when they're cataloged and all of that set of questions too. So I'd like to ask you one final question about this piece. Which has to do with color. And so you referenced, or you mentioned that the images that you have taken, so the images on one side of these kind of flat but slightly curved pieces of clay are in color, and the others, I believe the slides from your dad are not in color, that they're black and white images rendered here in a sort of sepia tone. And I'm curious what connections you're making between color and time, maybe, and sort of presentness versus past. And I'll also ask you to keep a good, strong voice for us too, so we can all hear really clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sepia tones of the iron oxide fired decals just immediately evoke past tense for me. And I think widely do evoke past tense. So there's a placing in time. I'd like to go back to that when we talk about the next work, but I wanted to just quickly mention, I feel I didn't fully respond to the question around second exile. And
sure.
I want to say that it is an important interruption in this work and in my father's life. Because he left Trinidad when it was a British colony. He came to Canada and he closed the door. And we didn't know about, it's not like he was proud of any of his heritage or culture or traditions or cooking, just absolutely embraced, Western European, everything. And it really, for him, it wasn't until the last 20 years of his life that he was able to come full circle and embrace and himself, for the first time, inquire and look at where he came from and what his past was. And I was so fortunate to find a book on his bookshelf about that, about the history of South Asians in Trinidad, where he had underlined and marked what was important to him. So all of that fed into this work.
Oh, wow. That's great that you have like notes from him about what stood out in that that publication. That's interesting. So this is a great kind of lead into the next question. Maybe we can think about this, this notion of color and time and sepia. And I'm interested in how the ideas sort of translate into a material practice, because you absolutely have, I think, a material practice. There's a really kind of core element in there that these are sculptures. Like, these are works that are functioning with images and that are using images, but they're also very much objects. So I'm curious for you to speak more about these questions of color and material.
Yeah, I really wanted to make this piece, building blocks, out of all sepia tone image, transfer onto ceramics. And what's different about this work is it was the first time that I worked out the technical details of getting ceramic decal onto sort of the porous material of stoneware. So so an unglazed stoneware surface for the ceramic artists out there. So yes, and one of the criteria I had when I was choosing the images for this work was that all of these photographs had to have been taken before I was born. So that was a criteria.
Why do you think that was important to you?
Well, I guess one has to draw a line in the sand, and the overall conceptual idea about this piece is that we are, the sum of all those who have come before us. And so, again, I set myself up some rules. I mean, in the form, there's a game, and so there's rules to the game. And, one of the rules was there will be an equal number of McMenemy, my maternal family line, images as there are McKenzie, my paternal line. So that was a rule. And another rule was all of the images will have had to be taken before I was born. And some of these images go right back to the ancestor. In fact, I know they're both there. I don't know if you can see them in the photograph, but the woman who came from India in 1865 is photographed. She lived to be 103. And the McMenemy that came from Ireland in 1854 is also in this piece. Yeah.
One of the things that intrigues me about this work is you've referenced it with the idea of rules and with kind of the aggregation part of it, and it has this element of play because, of course, they're blocks. They're like building blocks, right? And I guess one of the questions that I ask myself about this work, and so since we're talking, I'll also ask you. It has to do with this relationship between narrative and inquiry, basically, because on some level, these blocks can be assembled into a narrative. They sort of create a story. A chronological story at some point where you've just pointed out kind of the origin points of those two migrant ancestors of yours. And so in a way, there's a linear narrative to this work that starts with those two figures and kind of comes into the present and into you. There's that question of time again and chronology and narration, but it's also an unstable story in that we can move, like we have to identify who those two are, or we can move the blocks around. We can make the story into something else. And in that, to me, there's embedded the idea of inquiry or of questioning. And I'm curious for you, thinking about this work now or looking at it now, how much are you thinking of this as sort of asking questions of yourself and your family about all of these figures and who they are and how they fit together and how they make sense to you and sort of how you ended up here, versus using the piece or having the piece resolve those questions for you of like, okay, well, this is a narrative, or this is the extent to which this narrative, this familial ancestral narrative of myself is stable, versus it's one of inquiry?
I love that question because, so first of all, this is the third iteration of the piece. It started as 5 blocks, then it moved to 12, and now it's at 23, I believe. And over the last few months, as I moved the piece to a larger piece, there was a lot of inquiry, investigation, and new information uncovered. In fact, there were images that I had used before. I didn't actually know who the people were, and I was able to have them identified. And again, work with a relative in the UK, work with my mother while she was alive, work with, there was a cousin of my mother's who I found through a distant relative in Florida who had saved an email that she printed out in, 20 years ago, which led me to the gentleman who had the whole family history dating back to Ireland. I mean,
the archive, he had the archive, right?
He had the physical archive. And I have actually worked with all my cousins on the McMenemy side to bring that up to date in the last 20 years. So storytelling and narrative is definitely a huge part of this piece, but I would say equally as important as the inquiry and the uncovering and the discovery of the work.
Do you feel like the narrative is still coming into focus in a way, or do you have a pretty clear understanding of it?
I think I think that we never really finish our self-inquiry. I mean, there's not an end point. So
sure.
I would have to say that it there's room for it to come into focus, and I plan on continuing to work, not necessarily with my own family archive, but with images that relate to the people's that make up my own specific hybrid mix. Yeah.
Right. There's this other wonderful aspect of histories and family stories and narratives that is sort of mythological in nature, right? The notion of these like family myths and family stories that I think are embedded into everyone's families. And often as we start to look at or find or gain access to archives, to, evidence of ourselves, we start to, kind of find out ways that those things that we thought about our families are not always true, or like not always the case. Do you feel like there's a sort of mythological component to the stories that are being kind of unearthed and viewed here in this piece?
Yes, absolutely. I think every family has its own myths, and a very concrete myth which we were able to debunk was the McKenzie came from a mixed race marriage. DNA testing, not a possibility. Every family has its own myths, and I like the fact that you bring it up, because again, as a conceptual level, the American anthropologist Donna Taylor talks about the mixed race person as someone who can bridge the past, the present, the future, and the real or imagined future, I guess, and kind of be that intermediary, and present their expression of identity in sort of hopeful ways. So that also informs this work.
It's like a superpower, right? Yeah.
Superpower.
I'll remind folks that we're happy to take questions. We'll probably go through them all as a cluster toward the end. So we've had some come in. I'd encourage more folks, if you have questions that you'd like us to relay to Heidi, please type them into the Q&A function here in Zoom. And Heidi, I'd like to ask you one more question about this piece, which harkens back to your previous career, actually. So I mentioned at the beginning that you had worked in arts administration and in radio in particular. And we've talked about this work around the notion of narrative and storytelling, and the stability or instability of narratives. And it seems to me that radio is like is really one of the most amazing sources of narrative and of storytelling that we have today. And I'm curious if there are ways that you feel like your thinking about storytelling and narrative have been informed by your practice in radio prior to working in clay and in visual art.
Wow, that's a great question, and I hadn't thought about it directly, but I have to say I have thought about my radio editing as recently as this week. And I think I was thinking about it because one of my mentors recently retired, and I was thinking about how much I learned from her, and how much fun it was to work on Canada Reads, and the challenge of taking an hour and a half interview and finding that perfect 21 minutes and 30 seconds and the perfect 45 second and the perfect, and putting sound bites and narratives together. And now that you mention that, Sequoia, I have to say that there is this part of the brain, I think, that I'm working as I start to figure out a piece, because I don't have it fully formed in my mind before I start. There's a working out, and there's something that I really noticed recently, like quite recently, is how much I have to slow down to think through the work that I'm doing. It's such a different experience than sitting down to throw 50 mugs. Not that there's anything, I'm not saying that they're not on par. They're definitely on par, but it's a different exercise. It's engaging a different part of the brain. So there is that sort of editorial information and kind of flexing of that muscle that I think does inform the creative process.
Super interesting to think about slowing down and sort of the rate at which we work, and how different kinds of labor that we do have different kind of temporal signatures in some way. And I feel like this is a great starting point for thinking about clay as a specific medium, because I think for a lot of people, clay has and ceramic kind of has a very particular pace to it almost. Most of the time, most folks are working with clay in the wet state. It has to dry out. Often clay will have to dry in varying degrees to be able to perform the next function. There's firing is also usually part of the ceramic process, and that has a kind of temporal dimension to it too. And so I think for a lot of folks who work in clay, there's a feeling of really having to kind of partner with the medium and its own needs, right? Its own needs in a lot of respects, but in its own sort of temporal needs. And so I'm curious about, I guess I feel like for a lot of people, clay sort of slows them down. Like a lot of folks feel like, I've heard a lot of people express the idea that like their thoughts and their vision is moving very quickly, but the actual like physical act of making something in clay in particular sort of slows us down. In a good way. And I'm wondering, as you're thinking about slowing yourself down, or where you're slow and where you're fast, how much the specificity of the medium comes into that thinking?
I think it comes in, absolutely. I think the specificity of the medium kind of saturates my process. And I was recently thinking about the fact I had an exchange with a potter friend of mine who's a successful potter in New York. And I was just saying, I've just done test tiles with 8 different kinds of clay to try and figure out which clay I'm going to use for this project. And he's like, you haven't figured out which clay body you're using? I was like, well, each idea that I have requires me to think about which medium of clay is going to be the right one to use. And so the medium, and then there's, the macroscopic idea of clay as a medium being, fragile and yet permanent at the same time. And so there's the macro, and then there's the micro. And so I don't know if I should admit this, but this piece is, highly grogged stoneware and slab built hand by hand. But I originally set out to build these with molds using porcelain slip cast, because I thought, I'll just be able to make, hundreds and hundreds. And however, I did try. I spent a few weeks trying, and at the time I wasn't really able to master the technological challenges. I think I probably could now. I have a stronger understanding of mold making, but in the end, I chose to continue with the handmade process because I actually love the fact that they're not perfect.
It's sort of like learning what the work is by making it, right? And where it's important, like whether it's important to construct it versus cast it.
Yes, constructing it versus casting it, yes.
You've mentioned pottery now a couple of times. I'm curious, like, I sort of know the answer to this question, but I'm wondering if, like, do you make pots, and how do you make, like, how do you think of, we're not looking at any vessels here at all. We're looking at images and objects, and very sort of planar images, the first piece, the second, and maybe we'll even go to the third one for this question. I'm thinking about, and we'll talk more directly about this piece in just a sec, but maybe I'll use this as a launch pad to ask you about pottery, and like, how does pottery fit into your practice, and is it meaningful to you, and if so, how?
Well, I started when I was working as, to learn to throw on the wheel, on a kick wheel in the outdoors in India. I started making pots, and, I made mugs until I could make 12 exactly the same. And I made soup dishes with lids until I could make 12 exactly the same. And then I made bowls, and then I made, ultimately I made large bowl. And so I had that sort of condensed formal training of throwing pots. But when I went to Sheridan, I immediately knew that I wasn't a potter, that I had so many stories and narratives that I needed to tell, that I was a sculptor. And I shouldn't say I immediately knew. I have to give the great late Les Manning huge credit for helping me unlock that portal, I think, within me. And then I didn't make pots. And then my father died, and we've been speaking about that, so I feel comfortable mentioning it. And literally something in my head went off and said, I can't make sculpture, I have to make pots. And it was a voice in my, and it literally, and so that's when I started making functional pots that are the ones that you might be able to purchase at the Gardner Museum. I have to say I find it difficult to switch gears between making functional work and making sculptural work. I have a whole line of functional work sorted out and tested, and I actually took a glaze test tile out of the kiln with the last sculptural firing. But it's there, and it's going to happen. But it's not going to happen before I finish the next couple of projects I have on my table. So for me, they're very again, they use very different parts of my brain.
Yeah, sort of like distinct areas that you explore, I guess, in your work, distinct zones in some way. Looking at this image of body imaged, one thing that strikes me as being related to pots about this piece is this idea of series and working in a series. So these are images on a number of tiles. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about this piece and how it's made, and also address this question of series, and which was also relevant to the previous work too, but like, is this the full extent of this work? Do you see it as ongoing? Can it take many forms, or does it exist in this one particular arrangement?
Okay, wow, it's a big question. I don't know where to start. I'm going to start at the end and then work backwards, which is, yes, it is part of
Yes, that's a very good.
I want to do more. Joan Bennett, in fact, mentioned to me, wouldn't these look great on real X-ray machines? And I was like, yes, you think you could find me some? So yes, I think that there's more to do. I did a whole room at the Gladstone Hotel around telling my own healing journey, called Body Within. And this is one of the works that was there. And I did this piece specifically for the Gladstone, but I think it will go in other directions. So these are 42 4.5 inch by 6 inch by 0.02 inch, which is 0.05 millimeters thick porcelain ceramic substrate. And it's a medium that I first became aware of through the late Robin Hopper, who was one of our amazing guest coaches at Sheridan. And he was painting on them with underglaze pencils and underglaze paints, and doing beautiful work on these tiles, much larger. He was working on. He gave each one of us one of these tiles, and he said, "If you can think of something, just do it." And
that's a great motto for life, actually, isn't it?
I know. I gotta get the T-shirt. And as I was thinking about kind of curating my room around my healing journey, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I have to somehow express how, the journey that I've been through to find a place of healing through the medical system, and all of the tests and the x-rays and the imaging that I've been through. And that was, so I guess, I trudged around to all the hospitals. It's not hard to do. And now, of course, you can sign into your portal. Of course, a few months later, now it's all at your fingertips. But before, you had to go around and get the disc. You had to go to internet cafe to use a PC. Anyway, I got all these images, and I've constructed them at the House of Cards. So there's that playfulness, a game, a toy, a child's toy, the fragility. It looks even better when there's light coming through it. So, the translucency of the body imaging. But specifically, I think one of the reasons we included it in this chat today was that for me, the root of my chronic illness manifest as an adult because I inherited a gene that carries a rare kidney disease, medullary sponge kidney disease, and it caused and has caused an enormous amount of grief, setback, pain, and challenge in my life. So many of those images relate to that, not all. I don't know how much detail you want to know, but that's where that piece came from.
It's interesting looking at the work that I guess all three, I'm thinking of the images themselves, the tile form and the arrangements of the tiles, the sort of house of card forms, that they're all, and together, they're very sort of clean and very seductive in some way. They're very beautiful, and they're sort of austere a little bit, but they're also very graceful. I find them very elegant too. And thinking about how that set of associations sort of balances out with the pain, the grief, the struggle, the complexity of the physical condition, sort of the kind of the awesome aspect maybe of the human body, and the way that it can really hurt too, and it can really be like difficult and challenging. Were you thinking about sort of the extent to which in this work you wanted to communicate that experience of I guess the direct experience of pain or difficulty or grief, as opposed to a more sort of refined or elegant conception?
I think I was less thinking about conveying pain as I was, because actually as I worked with the images, I was surprised to discover how aesthetically beautiful some of them were. And that informed my choice as to which of the myriad of images I was going to use. And so less so much about communicating pain as wanting to communicate the overwhelm of it all. So hence 42 and not 12. So to have like a large number, and three sides of each of the, we're only seeing one side, and there's three sides of each of those triads. Just to sort of communicate the overwhelm of it all.
It's interesting how distinct it is from the images of your fathers. There's such different ways of representing a person or an identity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, this is obviously more corporeal. It's more internal. It really is looking at the guts of who I am. And I actually felt empowered to own those images, like to have had them floating out there for a decade and me not owning them. And now I've got them all. I own them. Right? And my images, and I can do what I want with them. And if I want to make art, I'm going to make art.
Mm. You mentioned briefly the notion of light and how light can pass through these. So the tiles, again, are porcelain and they're very, very thin, as you've said. And so they are translucent. So they are screens to some extent also. Can you speak a little bit more about that role of light in this work?
Yeah, well, I think coming back to where I want to go next, I've been thinking about light boxes. I've been thinking about, enlarged slide tables with light behind them to literally force that issue of the translucence of because that's, I mean, I suppose now our medical professionals are working on a digital screen, so there's less of the luminescence coming through, but I think I wanted to use these porcelain tiles specifically, as opposed to, say, making my own handmade ones that would be never thin enough to be that translucent. Because there is this sort of diaphanous quality to the body and to experiencing the body as an X-ray or an MRI or a CT. I think, there's not only diaphanous, but a fluidity. It's an imprint. It's something that actually, I think, coming back to that question around sepia and time, something about using these in the color that they were photographed in, something about the translucency of them makes them gone in an instant. There's a fleetingness to the time.
Yeah, almost like a slide projection too, right? I mean, I love that your dad took slides rather than photos or rather than print photos. That seems really related to these.
Yeah, I hadn't made that connection, but they're a snapshot in time that aren't easily accessible.
This is great. So we're going to go to some questions now from the group. And if you've been listening and you've had some question forming in your head, now would be a great time to type it into the Q&A function. So Heidi, let me see. I'm going to start to share some of these with you. There's a question around, here, I think I'll just read it. So one of the participants is asking, is there a deliberate selection of the pieces? For example, the foundation, pillars in chronology, functionality, or personal artistic approach?
Relating to this image specifically?
This, I think, came up before we were speaking about this one and more in connection to this building blocks piece. So I think the question more around the deliberateness of the selection and the idea of chronology being a pillar or a foundation of your particular approach.
I would have to say no.
Good answer.
I much as I would like to sort of tell you that I planned it all out to the last detail, a lot of it had to do with the aesthetics of which images might look best on a square face, which ones might work on the bridge, which ones might work in a portrait landscape, or landscape or portrait format. Really, the chronology of the imagery was not a factor. It was more, okay, there are my great-great-grandparents on my father's side. I need a maternal image. I've already got a portrait. Let me try and find something a little less posed. It was aesthetic qualities as opposed to chronology.
Interesting. We have another question asking when you know a work is complete or ready for presentation, which I think is relevant as in this work, which you've mentioned continues to grow and I don't think is necessarily finished yet. When do you know you want to share a work? When do you know when it's finished?
That's well, I mean, with this piece, the building blocks that you have up, I mean, right now a few of them are scattered out at the Leslie Grove Gallery in the East End, and they're literally just scattered at one level, like a child had thrown them right out of the box. But I've been asked to imagine, if I had a room, how would I display them? And I stopped at 23 or 24 pieces because in my mind, how I'd like to see this piece exhibited is, on a wall with group 3 is sets of 3 or 4 with 2, 2, 2, and 1. So sort of forming like a Monopoly house. Further underscore this notion of home and who we are and family. So now that I have enough to do that, I could say, okay, I'm finished.
That's interesting, but you don't really know until you get there, right? Like, it doesn't sound like that was your thought at the beginning. Yeah.
It was not. I thought at the beginning. No.
Interesting. Okay, another question has to do, is a little bit of a tricky one. It has to do with our the internal critic that we all carry along with us. And sometimes they're very loud and sometimes we find great ways to shush them a little bit. So the question is, what are the elements of work that you struggle the most with this internal critic? And what are there aspects of your work that you feel like you're not happy about and that you could, where you would want to try to change your work or improve it as best you could?
Well, I do carry more than an ounce of perfectionism in me. So it's funny that someone would ask me that, because I have a whole other series we haven't discussed today, working in the Caribbean archival photography, and I've just decided I'm going to redo a bunch of the tiles because they're not perfect. And that's my own inner critic, as opposed to someone else who might say, well, if you just put a little caulking in here, it might work. So, I mean, there's that. So I guess I do, well, you know, I just mentioned I tried 8 different kinds of clay because I'm looking for the right porcelain to do a future project in. I'm still looking, and I'm not going to stop until I find the right one. So,
you haven't made those mugs yet, right?
No, this is another installation piece, the maternal lineage one. But
okay,
it's yeah, it has to be right. So I do have a critic inside of me that more than stops me, propels me.
That's a great way to think of it. Propulsion, for sure. So we have time for one last question, and you know what? Maybe I will take us out of the slideshow for this last question. And this has to do with the residencies that we mentioned really briefly at the beginning. And so you have worked abroad in a number of countries, India, Denmark, Australia. And the question is asking how these have impacted your work, and how have you incorporated the different experiences that you've had in these places into your way of thinking about your artwork?
Okay, we need another hour.
Okay, so when should we schedule this?
I'll try and be brief. You know, when I first started in China, I didn't know what to expect, and I went eyes wide open. And I just was a receptacle of information. And as I have evolved in my career, I know now that it's much better to go with a plan. And allow that plan to shift as it may, but to go with a plan, and to allow the environment that you're in to inform the work that you're making and the people that you're with. So, I mean, that was very prominent in my experience in Australia. You know, I've just booked to be in Medalta again, COVID permitting, this summer, because there's a project that I'm doing about the local brick factories there. So, that's very much, I mean, obviously can't get any more informed by your space than making subject matter that directly relates to the environment that you're in. So I think that answers that question.
Interesting. Wow. So before we go, I will ask you about this boat that's behind you. Can you tell us just super briefly, like what it is? Because I'm sure a lot of us have been wondering, like, what's going on.
So that's a cardboard maquette of the Fat Al Razak, which was the first boat that came from India to Trinidad. And so May 30th was the 150th anniversary of the arrival. And I have just been playing with a new material for me, Caraflex, and I'm making the sails. I'm going to show you.
Oh, wow.
On May 30th, for the first time ever, they released to the public digitally the archive of the images of the registry of those people who came on the boat. So cut right back full circle to archive. As soon as I had those images available to me, I immediately thought, I have to use those images.
Yeah, sure.
How am I going to use those images? And they are going to be the sails of five sail ships that were typical of that time period. So
cool. That's fantastic. What a great story and great place to end on, with something that we can all, I think, look forward to seeing somewhere down the road in your work. Thank you so much for spending this time. It's been really great to have the opportunity to speak with you at some greater length about some of your recent work.
thank you so much.
Yeah, wonderful. And everyone, the Gardener is open, as we are keeping it safe at the Gardener. We're open from Thursdays to Sundays every week. We're free on the weekends. So we have lots of cool stuff for you to see. The exhibition Raw stays on view for a little over a week through November 8th. And if you haven't seen it, or even if you have seen it, come and see it again, because it's in its final manifestation. And once again, I'll say thank you, Heidi, so much. It's been a real treat to get to speak with you today.
All right, be well.
Okay, you too. Stay healthy. Bye-bye, everyone. Be well. Toodaloo.